Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. George Santayana, 1905. What's past is prologue. William Shakespeare, probably around 1610. It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. J.R.R. Tolkien, 1947. Hi, I'm Frank Speidel, a retired emergency physician and recovering hospital administrator, and welcome to The Doctor Is In. In this show, with the help of guests, we explore healthcare in the U.S. and its interface with society. I host this show not to practice medicine, but to question and discuss healthcare in the U.S. For guidance on healthcare decisions, I recommend you consult your primary family physician. In April of 2023, President Biden declared the national COVID emergency had ended. We had lost over 1 million of our fellow American citizens and flattened our economy and cratered the education of our children. Since the pandemic, we have seen a phenomena, both remarkable and ominous, the absence of thoughtful review of these seismic events and our response to what we endured. On a national level, there has been no review of the national response to the pandemic. In April of 2022, the then CDC Director Rochelle Walensky ordered a new review of the CDC's performance during the pandemic. The review, using both internal and external stakeholders, has been described by many as scathing. In December of 2022, the majority staff of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs produced a document, Historically Unprepared: Examination of the Federal Government's Pandemic Preparedness and Initial COVID-19 Response. But no government commission, such as the 9/11 Commission, was created to understand and examine our response to a pandemic that killed over 1 million Americans. This response to understanding the pandemic prompted 34 individuals of diverse backgrounds to form the COVID Crisis Group. This group, many of whose members were on the 9/11 group, was to examine the events and recommend changes. A robust examination of the COVID pandemic and our response to it is needed and overdue. Decisions we as a society made had consequences, and those consequences are still with us. The National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, reports the average public school student lost 10 points in math and 6 points in reading compared to pre-pandemic testing. Despite recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics in the summer of 2020 to open schools in the fall, most schools remain closed. This was an opening in person, it was supposed to be. There was a pandemic, so we had to be safe. We closed schools, we didn't want to, but we wanted to be safe. Why take chances? Lives are at stake. We wanted to open them as soon as possible, but safely. With the best of intentions, Dr. Fauci and Randy Weingarten, head of the American Federation of Teachers, all wanted schools to open, but with caution. It had to be done safely. For many of us, thinking about safety is a flawed process. Safety is not binary. Is it safe to ride a motorcycle, to fly in a plane? Is it safe to go to dinner with friends? Safety is a spectrum. We can always make things safer, but at a cost. This is true in medicine and true in life. Now, not all schools shut down. Some stayed open, in particular schools. At the time, Randy Weingarten described this action as, quotation marks, reckless, cruel, and callous. What were the results? No drop-off in NAEP scores for the Catholic schools. Well, they must have been hotspots for transmission. Surely they were super spreaders. No, didn't happen. And we've looked for reports. There's nothing, nada. I offer a Freddy's milkshake to anyone who can produce a controlled study showing that opening Catholic schools spike transmissions somewhere. To help me understand these errors, my understanding, I've asked Dr. Beth Ann Rosica, a fierce, educated, informed advocate for advocating our children with wit and energy. She is relentlessly arguing for our children in schools, most especially those at risk and marginalized. Dr. Rosica, welcome to the Doctor's Inn. What did I get wrong?
Well, it's always nice to see you, Frank. Thank you for having me on the show. Well, I think the first thing that you got wrong was that Randi Weingarten was in favor of opening schools safely. She was not in favor of opening schools at all. And as we've seen, the teachers union has played an insidious role in keeping our schools closed, continuing to mask kids well after the time when we knew that it was not effective. They have political aims that have absolutely nothing to do with teaching and learning and academic outcomes for our children.
The metrics I kind of went over earlier about the drops in school, is that reasonable from what you've seen?
All of the research that I've been looking at, not just in Chester County, in Pennsylvania, but across the country, shows that in locations with extended school closures, the academic achievement, the testing scores have dropped significantly for kids. And what a lot of people don't understand is that even prior to school closures, prior to the pandemic, we were seeing trends of scores dropping. And people are going to say, well, standardized test scores aren't a good measure. And believe me, with a PhD in education, having worked in this field my entire life, I am not a huge proponent of standardized testing. I do not think that they tell the full story of any particular child. However, it is the only methodology that we have to measure large groups pre and post to see where we are. And so for that reason, I do believe that the standardized tests are helpful to understand what's been happening. So we were seeing, particularly in Pennsylvania, we were seeing a general decline in scores prior to the pandemic. And what we've seen after the pandemic and school closures is an acceleration of that process. In many school districts, either just about half or over half of students in elementary school are not proficient in reading and math. And I want to say that again, because I don't think that people fully understand what I'm saying. Almost half of our children in public schools are not proficient in reading and math. These are significant issues, and particularly at the elementary school. If you're not a fluent reader when you leave elementary school, the likelihood that you are going to become a fluent reader in middle school or high school is very low. It's not impossible, it can be done, but the chances of that happening are very, very low.
When you start out with a crumbling foundation, nothing large can be built, nothing significant can be achieved. It sounds like we've really hard or soft wired a crumbling foundation for children just starting their participation in the world. I shared with you before the show that Monica Gandhi, who has been a guest on The Doctor Is In, who also felt the same way about masking children and all this foolery. She shared a statistic which I found incredible. In her book, she mentions that if we say children are those under 20, and we look at what happened to them during the pandemic, we saw the following. That there were deaths, to be sure, and we're not talking about deaths of people with pre-existing conditions, although the majority of deaths, more than 2/3, were children under 20 with pre-existing conditions. But all the children's deaths were a given number. And that was dwarfed by the number of children, that is those under 20, that we lost to overdoses and suicides because of the disruption of all the social structures supporting the mendings, that interactions, the healing that interactions with people do. Are you surprised by that? Do you think Dr. Gandhi missed something on that?
No, I think she's spot on with that. And as I've told my story many times, when I wrote my first letter to Governor Wolf in April 2020, imploring him to reopen schools and predicting the consequences that would occur as a result of extended school closures, I stated that the mental health of our children would be compromised. And my expectations were sadly way exceeded in terms of the impacts that these school closures had on kids. We have a mental health crisis
Yes.
across this country. I read article after article of adolescent psychiatric units that are filled. They're building one, in Philadelphia right now to accommodate this crisis that absolutely could have been averted. And to your point, Frank, so many people were worried about compromised children. And there were actually lawsuits here locally. There were a group of parents that brought a lawsuit against a school district saying, you can't open schools for children because my child is compromised and they could be more at risk if they were, if the schools were open. Well, those parents could choose to keep their child at home. And every school offered remote learning. Nobody ever had to send their child to school if it wasn't the right option for them. But what we've done to those physically healthy children, they're in incredibly bad shape right now.
You're such an expert on this. In Chester County, did all the school districts follow the same approach to the pandemic?
In Chester County, by and large, the school districts followed the same approach because of the reckless decision-making of one bureaucrat, Jean Franklin, the Department of Health at the Chester County Department of Health, the director. She pushed these districts and provided guidance that every district basically said, well, we pretty much have to follow this guidance around opening schools. Now, some of the Southern Chester County schools did veer off a little bit, and particularly with masking, they let up on the masking sooner than other districts. But Jean Franklin is responsible for much of the devastation that has occurred throughout Chester County.
What about the Catholic schools in Chester County?
So the Catholic schools did follow the guidance from Jean Franklin. However, they were in a different situation in that they had more space to be able to accommodate. So for a while, Franklin insisted on 6 feet of social distancing. Many of the Catholic schools could accommodate 6 feet of social distancing between desks because they had more space to be able to do that. The Catholic high school, Bishop Shanahan, as I understand, they had to start off doing hybrid, some kids in every other day because they couldn't do quite 6 feet, but they at least still opened, whereas the rest of the high schools in the county that first fall did not open. But the Catholic schools did an amazing job of prioritizing education, academics, and what was right for kids and for the teachers, because the teachers there, and I will guess that many of them were more open to coming into schools because they're not union members and they were committed to doing what was right for kids.
One of the earliest shows during the pandemic on The Doctor Is In, I was honored to have Dr. Paul Offit on as a guest. And we talked about school opening. And I hope I get Professor Offit exactly right on this, but his comment was schools need to be open. And he was very much emphatic about that. He says, unfortunately, what's going to happen is some teacher is going to get COVID and die. Maybe not from the children, because children aren't transmitters, but it's going to happen, and it's going to be, I told you so. And he's saying, it's going to be, we are driving ourselves to safety by over the futures of our children. And safety, as most reasonable people understand, safety is not binary. I can always make things safer, but there's a cost. And the cost for trying to optimize safety. And children aren't the transmitters, they're not the drivers. The cost for doing that was we have now crater children, and we have literally multiple years of children that are going to be scarred by this. Do you sense a reluctance on society's part, in organizations and societies, to look back and think about how we responded to this?
Oh, I think that's 100% accurate, Frank. You see this particularly with parents, and many parents ask me, why aren't people more involved and, figuring out what's going on? And I tell people that I think so many parents are just so relieved that their kids are back in school and they don't have to wear masks. And for the most part, their lives have gone back to normal. They've been able to go back to work. They've been able to go back to the gym. What activities have resumed, on the surface, life as normal has continued. So I think that most people are very, very reluctant to want to spend any time talking about this or dealing with this. And I think that it's a huge mistake. I mentioned right before the show, I got a note that there's an elementary school in Montgomery County, Maryland, that is resuming forced masking of elementary school children at school next week. So this is not going to go away in the way that people would like to think it is. I use as an example this week. It's very hot here. We're having, an Indian summer, a return of the heat wave. I mean, it's warm. It's 95 degrees outside. It's hot. But yet there are school districts all across the state that are either doing remote learning or early dismissals because their buildings don't have air conditioning. Now, I have two issues with this. First of all, we've had heat in Pennsylvania in September and in June for 100 years. This is not something new. So I guarantee you that people have had to go to school when it's 100 degrees without air conditioning. So this is not a new phenomenon. But what has happened is that the COVID response has allowed us to look at things differently, and it makes all of these decisions acceptable. My other issue with this is that all of these school districts received millions, in some instances billions of dollars in COVID relief funds that could be used for ventilation systems, which actually proved to be effective in minimizing the spread of disease. So why wouldn't they have spent their COVID relief dollars on air conditioning and air system that would minimize not just the likelihood of COVID, but just colds and flus and all of those airborne illnesses?
Let us agree for the record that we did not rehearse this beforehand, what you were just saying about the ventilation system. The few published reviews, the COVID work groups review, a little bit, actually a whole lot in the CDC review. One of the things they highlighted that I thought, thank God, was there was a silo thinking where people just talk to the person who they work with all the time. And Philip and Rachel's work down the hallway, we never bothered with that. So that you had this amazing situation where in the CDC, the standards, if you were going to, in a hospital, do something that was going to aerosolize infectious material, like doing a bronchoscopy on somebody with tuberculosis, where you were going to put the offending agent in the air, the solution, if you're going to do that, was to achieve 3 air exchanges a day. 3 air exchanges an hour. Just exchange the volume of air in that room 3 times in an hour. And voila, we did not transmit TB or other infectious diseases. Air exchanges make life go forward. Having had to build a hospital and meet these standards, I knew about that. And I knew that it wasn't the end of the world to get this 3 air exchanges. There's never been transmission on a commercial airliner. Why was that?
Because the air exchange occurs
because
so
there's
frequently.
11 to 16 air
Right,
exchanges.
right.
But the CDC, in their folks' wisdom way back when they originally had people traveling back from China in the February-March timeframe of 2020, they said, well, we think they may have COVID, but we can't test for it. We don't know how to do that. They got a cough. They're not feeling well. They physically separated them on the plane. They put them like 2 rows ahead by themselves. And they followed the people on the plane, and no one got COVID. So physical separation, that does it. All I could think of is, did they understand they weren't going to get it anyway because the air exchanges are... So how many schools have you seen in Chester County that are getting ready for the next pandemic by elevating the standard of air exchanges?
Not a single one. I have not heard a single discussion about that.
Case in point. So I think you and I would be agreed that the reluctance to look at what we did wrong, to look hardly at what we could have done better, is hurting us, and it's going to be for the next event. And it may not be an infectious disease. It may be a dirty bomb. It may be a nuclear event at Peach Bottom. There's lots of things that our ability to respond to the unexpected, we didn't learn from this one. Is there any area in southeastern Pennsylvania that you think, schooling-wise, that you think responded well to the pandemic and is something that we should copy and follow?
Well, I do know that Souderton School District in Montgomery County, they opened fully and mostly normally in the fall of 2020. So if you recall, Governor Wolf at the time closed schools. Nobody had any choice. Even the Catholic schools, those first several months at the end of the school year in 2020, nobody was allowed to operate. Then in the fall, you could operate under certain guidelines, certain rules. But Souderton School District was committed to opening, and they ran a pretty much normal school year for all of 2020. And they did a good job, and the kids had a normalized experience. Like I mentioned, Bishop Shanahan in Chester County, they did start off hybrid, but then they were able to get all of those kids back in full time. So there are school districts and private schools that opened and did almost everything they could to provide a normalized school experience for kids. It's just very sad that the majority of districts in southeastern Pennsylvania were guided by fear and threats, and really the teachers union. The teachers union had a huge part to play in keeping these schools closed and in keeping the kids forcibly masked.
The fear presence. I was stunned a while ago. Merrick Garland, the Attorney General for the United States, in October 4th, 2021, he issued a statement. It goes like this: in the coming days, the department will announce a series of measures designed to address the rise in criminal conduct directed towards school personnel. What was that all about?
Well, that was my new label. That was my label, my badge of honor as domestic terrorist. So parents who were speaking out at school board meetings were now considered domestic terrorists. And again, this all relates back to the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, and the NEA, the National Education Association, the top unions for teachers in the country, colluding, and I use that word very specifically, colluding with the White House and the Department of Justice to label parents speaking out about school closures, about masks, about concerns about what was happening in the classroom as domestic terrorists. And that was to intimidate people to stop speaking out.
Every time I talk, I love the way you phrase things and view things. I think that my views of the world may be a little bit twisted. No, I think I could not agree with you more. What going forward, what do you think we should do so we don't get ourselves into this mess again?
Well, I think to your point, Frank, people have to be willing to accept criticism of the decisions that were made. And I see that the majority of people, especially elected officials, are very, very reluctant to do that. So I'll give you a very easy example. We're coming up on an election in November. Pennsylvania has school board elections this year. And if I were an incumbent school board member rerunning for office, the first thing that I would do is I would make a public statement to say, the way that I voted 3 years ago to close schools and to mask kids is not how I would vote now, because I've learned differently. I made a mistake. It was with the best intentions, but I made a mistake. And I have yet to hear a single incumbent school board member to make that statement, because ultimately, all of those decisions are local decisions. Thankfully, we were able to pass the constitutional amendments, which limits our governor's ability to declare a state of emergency. Even people like Gene Franklin, county health directors, they cannot mandate anything. All they can do is make recommendations, and school directors can either have the courage and the guts to do what's right for our children, or they can pander to groups like the teachers union or some political party and follow the science, which is not actually science.
I could not agree with you more about when somebody declares they are the science. You're criticizing me, you're criticizing. I hope the sarcasm for Dr. Fauci comes through. It's terrifying. Yes. This kind of I was always charmed by Lord Protector of England, Oliver Cromwell's statement, "I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, think it possible, you may be wrong." And I think this healthy skepticism for what we know for a fact is long overdue. As we think about the response that we've seen, it's impossible to ask people making these decisions that strike lives to ask them, would you please explain why you're doing this?
Right.
The response you get is like out of the Wizard of Oz. The great Oz has spoken. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. This is a terrifying state we've gotten into, where people will not have a dialogue about why you choose to do this as opposed to why you chose to do that. Unlike Merrick Garland, I think our educational system needs more questioning, not less. Mm-hmm. And I want to thank you, Beth Ann, for being on here. We need more voices like you, Dr. Rosica. We need more people asking the questions and running for office and doing the things that, raising voices saying, why are you doing this? Why does the head of the CDC have to have a conference with the head of the AFT? Why are you sharing emails back and forth before you make policies? For our viewers, thank you for watching. Sometimes real progress comes not from broadcasting answers, but from asking questions. Be safe out there. And thanks again, Beth Ann, for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you.